Tupac Amaru II in 1780 wrote, "There have been repeated outcries directed to me by the indigenous people of this and surrounding provinces, outcries against the abuses committed by European-born crown officials, justified outcries that have produced no remedy from the royal courts." In response to European imperialism, nationalist movements emerged throughout South America, Africa, and Asia. Often the movement's leaders, such as Tupac Amaru II in Peru, had European-style educations. Many had developed a deep understanding of such Enlightenment ideas as natural rights, sovereignty, and nationalism. Some worked in official posts in colonial government. Some colonial elites used the education that imperialism provided to drive out their conquerors in the 20th century. Anti-imperial resistance often created new states. At its most powerful, the Ottoman Empire stretched deep into Europe. However, by the early 19th century, it was losing its hold on its remaining European territories in the Balkan Peninsula. Inspired by the French Revolution, ethnic nationalism emerged as the people of the Balkans sought independence. The growing ethnic tensions in the region set the stage for World War I. Serbia in 1815 and Greece in 1832 won independence only after long wars. Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, and Bulgaria all rebelled against Ottoman rule. In 1877, Serbia and Russia came to their aid in what was to be the last and most important Russo-Turkish War. After it ended in 1878, the Treaty of Berlin freed Bulgaria, Romania, and Montenegro, but placed Bosnia and Herzegovina under the control of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. In North America, following the British victory over the French in the French and Indian War, the British issued the Proclamation of 1763. This act reserved all the land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River for the natives, the first time a European government had recognized the territorial rights of indigenous people. However, the British colonists resented this interference into colonial affairs. After winning independence, citizens of the new United States soon overran the Ohio and Illinois river valleys, displacing the natives that lived there. After 1800, the Cherokee assimilated to white settler culture, adopting colonial methods of farming, weaving, and building. They developed an alphabet for writing their language, and within a short time almost the entire tribe was literate. And the Cherokee Phoenix became the first native newspaper in the United States. The Cherokee Nation even adopted a constitution based on the U.S. Constitution. But assimilation did not save the Cherokee from white America's greed. After the discovery of gold in 1829 on Cherokee land in Georgia, attempts began to force the Cherokee off their land. After Congress passed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, the Cherokee and other Southeast Native American tribes were forced to relocate to what is now Oklahoma. U.S. expansionism continued, affecting many Native people. In the northwestern United States around 1869, prophet dreamers among the northern Paiute Indians announced that the dead would soon come back and drive out the whites, restoring the lands and tradition of Native people. The ghost dance rituals of dances and songs were meant to hasten this event. The ghost dance spread from the Sierra Nevada to the Missouri River and from northern Texas to the Canadian border. It reached the Sioux by 1890, coinciding with the Sioux revolts. Sioux warriors wore ghost shirts. However, the ghost dance resistance movement fell at Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, marking the end of the Indian Wars. José Gabriel was a hereditary chief in southern Peru. He was descended from the last Inca ruler Tupac Amaru and took the name Tupac Amaru II, Born around 1740, he continued to identify with his Inca heritage in spite of having received a formal Jesuit education. In 1780, he was arrested and executed a colonial administrator, charging him with cruelty. This action led to the last general Indian revolt against Spain, which at first was supported by some Creoles. The revolt spread throughout southern Peru and into Bolivia and Argentina before Tupac Amaru II and his family were captured in March 1781. They were taken to Cusco, the former capital of the Inca Empire. There, Tupac Amaru II was forced to watch as his wife and sons were executed before he was tortured and executed himself. In 1863, a group of Mexican conservatives conspired with Emperor Napoleon III of France to overthrow the liberal government of Benito Juárez, a full-blooded Zapotec. Mexico owed France money, and Napoleon III wanted to further his imperialistic ambitions. He offered to make a European noble, Archduke Maximilian, the Emperor of Mexico. Maximilian was crowned on June 10, 1864. After 3 more years of war, Mexicans forced the French to withdraw from Mexico. Maximilian was executed by firing squad on June 19, 1867, and Juarez resumed the presidency. By the mid-19th century, sepoys, Indian soldiers under British employ, made up the majority of the British armed forces in colonial India. Most were Hindus or Muslims. In 1857, the British began using rifle cartridges that had been greased with a mixture of the fat of cows and pigs. Hindus, who viewed the cow as sacred, and Muslims, who refused to slaughter pigs, were both furious. Both were convinced that the British were trying to convert them to Christianity. Their violent uprising, known as the Indian Rebellion of 1857 or the Sepoy Mutiny, spread throughout cities in northern India. The British crushed the rebellion, killing thousands, but the event marked the emergence of Indian nationalism. After the Indian Rebellion, Britain also exiled the Mughal emperor for his involvement in the rebellion and ended the Mughal Empire. In its place, the British government took a more active role in ruling India. From 1858 until India won independence in 1947, the British Raj, or the colonial government, took its orders directly from the British government in London. Under the Raj, many Indians attended British universities. In 1885, several British-educated Indians established the Indian National Congress, through which began as a forum for airing grievances to the colonial government. It quickly began to call for self-rule. By the 1880s, the only independent country remaining in Southeast Asia was Thailand. The rest of the region was under the control of the Spanish, Dutch, British, and French. From the beginning of French colonialism in the region, many Vietnamese resisted. By 1884, when the 12-year-old Ham Nguyen became emperor, his top advisors were vocal critics of the French. The French soon tried to assert their control by raiding the royal palace, but the young emperor had been removed for safety. Ham Nguyen's supporters continued to resist French rule until he was captured in 1888 and exiled to Algeria. The resistance continued until in 1895 under Phan Den Phong, who became a hero to future revolutionaries in the Vietnamese resistance movement. The Philippines came under Spanish control in the 16th century, but there was no public education there until 1863. However, wealthy Filipinos sent their sons to Europe to study. One of these young men, Jose Rizal, started a reform movement called the Philippine League in 1892. Though the League was loyal to Spain, the Spanish feared it. They promptly arrested and executed Rizal, an action that shocked many Filipinos. There had been numerous rebellions throughout the history of Spanish rule, but now, for the first time, Filipinos had nationalist ambitions and the education needed to carry them out. In 1896, several revolts broke out in provinces around Manila, marking the beginning of the Philippine Revolution. The Spanish-American War broke out in 1898, and after a decisive American victory in the Battle of Manila Bay, exiled Filipino revolutionaries returned. Based on U.S. sympathy for Philippine independence, the rebels expected freedom. However, the Treaty of Paris ending the war merely transferred control of the Philippines from Spain to the United States. By the time the treaty was ratified in February 1899, hostilities had broken out in what was to be known as the Philippine-American War. The war ended in a U.S. victory in 1902. An estimated 20,000 Filipino troops were killed, and more than 200,000 civilians died as a result of the war. Of the 4,300 Americans who lost their lives, nearly two-thirds of them died from disease. Organized resistance continued until 1906, but the Philippines remained a U.S. possession until 1946. The Aboriginal people have been in Australia for an estimated 50,000 years and have the oldest continuous culture on Earth. At the time of European settlement, there may have been as many as 1 million people in 500 clans speaking 700 languages. In 1788, the British began sending convicts and soldiers to established colonies in New South Wales. The government instructed the settlers to treat the indigenous inhabitants kindly. However, the colonial government did not recognize indigenous land ownership. Further, because the indigenous inhabitants were not considered British subjects, they were not protected by law. Thousands of Aboriginal people were killed as they tried to defend their territory and resources from European settlers. Compared to the Aboriginals in Australia, New Zealand's Morai were newcomers, having arrived from Polynesia in the 14th century. Under the 1840 treaty, Britain had promised to protect property rights of the Morai. Within a short time, the Morai became alarmed by British settlement patterns, and the first of a series of Morai wars broke out. The British were eventually able to overcome the Morai in 1846. Relations deteriorated again in the 1850s as the Morai became reluctant to sell more land to settlers, fearing for their future. Ignoring the promise of the treaty, the government attempted to pressure the Morai to sell land, sending troops in 1861 to dislodge the Morai from the property in question. Another decade of fighting ensued. The war ended in an uneasy peace in 1872, but by 1900 the Morai had lost most of their land. Organized African resistance to imperialism developed later than Indian resistance. One reason for this difference in timing is that European powers had been in India much longer than they had been in Africa. In addition, British colonial governments in India were partially run by Indians, while colonial governments in Africa were largely run by military officials from Europe. However, by the end of World War I, Western educated Africans had a shared identity and nationalism known as Pan-Africanism. In West Africa in the 18th century, rulers often mixed Islamic and traditional religious practices. In 1804, a group of Muslim intellectuals led by Osman Dan Fodio started a drive to purify Islam among the Hausa tribes of the region. He created a caliphate with its seat in the new town of Sokoto. The Sokoto Caliphate established the slave trade as a means of economic growth at a time when the British were trying to stop it. The British Navy attempted to intercept ships carrying slaves, freeing them and relocating them in their colony, Sierra Leone. The Sokoto Caliphate was the largest African empire since the 16th century. It was finally subdued in 1903 when the British made it a part of their colony of Nigeria. From 1811 to 1858, the British fought the native Kusa people who did not want to be ruled by Europeans, whether Dutch or English. In 1856 and 1857, in the region east of the Cape Colony, some of the cattle of the local Kusa were getting sick and dying, perhaps from diseases caught from the cattle of the British settlers. The Kusa began to kill their cattle and destroy their crops in the belief that these actions would cause spirits to remove the British settlers from their land. Some 400,000 head of Kusa cattle may have been killed. The immediate result of the Kusa cattle killing movement was famine and the deaths of thousands of people. However, the British were not driven out of the area. In the 1870s, the British fought the Zulu kingdom located on the South African coast of the Indian Ocean, which had become a well-organized and centralized state. At first, this Anglo-Zulu war went in favor of the Zulus, but eventually the British defeated them and their lands became part of the British colony of South Africa. In West Africa in 1868, Mande chieftain Samari Touré led a group of warriors to establish a powerful kingdom in Guinea, extending it until the early 1880s. He opposed French attempts to annex West Africa, first fighting them in 1883. The French finally succeeded, but offered Samari their protection. When he was unable to extend his kingdom to the east, he again went to war with the French in 1891. After his forces were ejected, he tried to re-establish his kingdom in the upper Ivory Coast. The French finally captured him in 1898 and sent him into exile. In East Africa in 1881, a Sudanese Islamic cleric, Muhammad Ahmad, declared himself the Mahdi, or Guided One, who would restore the glory of Islam. The Sudanese had resented Egyptian rule for decades, and the arrival of the British in 1873 only fueled their resentment. Ahmad turned the political movement into a religious one, forming an army to fight against Egypt. By 1882, the Mahdist army had taken control of the area around the capital, Khartoum. The next year, a joint British-Egyptian military expedition launched a counterattack against the Mahdists. The Mahdists finally overran the British-Egyptian forces in January 1885. After Ahmad's death in June of that year, the Mahdist movement disintegrated, weakened by infighting among rival leaders. The British returned to the Sudan in 1896 and finally defeated the Mahdists in September 1898. Beginning in 1823, the British made several attempts to subjugate the Asante Empire in present-day Ghana in West Africa. The first four were unsuccessful. The fifth and final war is known as Ya Asante Wa, War of the Golden Stool. It began in March 1900 when the British government of the Gold Coast demanded the Golden Stool, a symbol of national unity. Ya Asante Wa, a mighty warrior queen, led a rebellion against the British. It was the last African war led by a woman, and it resulted in the deaths of 2,000 Asante and 1,000 British. The death toll was higher than in the first 4 years combined. The war ended in September 1900 with a British victory. Ya Asante Wa was exiled, and Asante became a part of the Gold Coast colony.